In our presentation today, Dr. Neha Mishra and I provide our perspective on the role of an electronic commerce chapter in the Australia-India CECA. As many of you know, India has been largely antagonistic to negotiating on e-commerce rules, at least under the aegis of the WTO. After the initial failure to conclude negotiations in 2015, Australia and India reopened the CECA negotiations in 2020. Trade ministers of both countries have expressed interest in adopting a high-quality electronic commerce chapter. This is quite significant for India and a very important area of dialogue between both the countries. Australia and India, in many ways, are natural partners when it comes to digital trade. In our paper, we first identify why Australia and India are natural partners and then provide our perspective on various disciplines that may be negotiated, some with relative degree of ease, while other areas could be hard to negotiate due to conflicting policy preferences of both the countries. Our paper suggests that despite the differences, both the countries can use the CECA negotiations as a foundation for strengthening their bilateral digital trade relations and must remain invested in the process by being pragmatic and perhaps moderately ambitious to accommodate both synergies and conflicts. It goes without saying that Australia can benefit immensely from exploring digital trade opportunities with India. This goes beyond the traditional e-commerce market. Some of you may know Australian products are already quite popular in Indian e-commerce marketplaces, but it's well beyond that. In digital services, in fintech, and in tech across various sectors of the economy, such as agriculture, mining, and so on. Top Indian companies, on the other hand, already have significant business presence in Australia, and being a leading digital services provider, Indian companies will continue to have more opportunities with a strengthened trading relationship. Digital trade relations are also important from a strategic or geopolitical point of view. India has enormous geopolitical advantage and the only potential counterweight to Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific region. India and Australia already engage in several important cyber initiatives, such as through the Quad, the G20, and Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. Recently, India and Australia have also strengthened their bilateral cooperation through the framework arrangement on the cyber and cyber-enabled critical technology cooperation, Australia and India Cyber and Critical Technology Partnership. These initiatives can lend further support to a growing digital trade relationship through consensus on high-level norms, standards, and best practices. Ultimately, our paper argues that both countries must remain committed to the electronic commerce chapter to build trusted and sustainable relationship in digital trade, but they may need to do so pragmatically, cautiously, and perhaps with a manageable degree of ambition. The digital trade governance of India and Australia are at a high level are quite different and can be seen as conflicting. While Australia tends to follow a mostly liberalised open framework for digital trade, India in recent years has shifted towards an inward-looking protectionist framework for digital trade regulation. There are some examples to demonstrate these differences, which we discuss in detail in our paper. India has refused to participate in the JSI negotiations, pointing out systemically how it may not be in the interests of developing countries, and arguing how it conflicts with the legal premise of the WTO agreement, which follows a consensus-based approach. Any dialogues on e-commerce must be limited to the work program on e-commerce. India has not been forthcoming in signing any FTAs in recent years. India even refused to sign the RCEP. Of course, the refusal does not seem to have been primarily related to digital trade provisions. India has advocated against expanding the moratorium on customs duties on electronic commerce, which has been renewed several times since its inception. India, along with South Africa delegation, has argued that the moratorium will affect revenue collection in developing countries as the world gets more digitalised. In the past, India has only signed one FTA with Singapore with an e-commerce chapter. This was way back in 2007. However, interestingly, this FTA contained a provision on non-discrimination in digital products and an agreement that both parties will not impose customs duties on electronic transmissions. It's unlikely that India would sign such an FTA today, at least not without enormous resistance and negotiations. Our paper also highlights various aspects of India's domestic regulatory framework and its protectionist inclinations. Whether it is the preference for data localization, local content requirements, explicit protection given to the domestic digital sectors, and even FDI policies in domestic sectors. Some of these policies may almost be viewed as import substitution. In contrast, our paper details how Australia's domestic legal framework, as well as its commitments in FTAs, indicate a highly liberalised approach towards digital trade. For instance, the SAIELN is arguably the most comprehensive e-commerce agreement in the world today. So while at a high level, there seems to be many complementarities, the question remains if India and Australia can deal with such granular differences. In our paper, we argue that the different policy approach in both countries does not mean that both the countries cannot find any common bases for negotiations. Let's start with some areas where we think synergies are feasible and how that might be beneficial for digital trade. First is online consumer protection. Most Australian FTAs contain a provision on online consumer protection. With India now updating its consumer protection law for the digital economy, there's no reason why both countries cannot build a meaningful provision in this area. This could include potentially expanding the scope of regulatory cooperation, perhaps even considering routes to look at online dispute resolution mechanisms in both countries. Second is cybersecurity and spam. This is not an easy area to negotiate, and the role of trade agreements in this area should be carefully circumscribed. However, the fact that Australia and India are cooperating in cybersecurity and other fora will make it easier to provide the necessary cybersecurity conditions for digital trade. Similarly, spam could be another area for cooperation as it is aligned with both countries' regulatory framework. 3, digital trade facilitation, paperless trading. This is an area where both countries will see eye to eye. Both are members of the TFA. It's also important that Australia consider the incentives it may be able to offer to India on digital trade facilitation issues, especially through technical assistance and capacity building and support and so on. 4, artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. This is an area which is ripe for high-level digital trade cooperation. It is less usual to contain provisions in this area, but the DEPA and SADIA, for instance, contain high-level provisions on artificial intelligence ethics, which can help build trust in digital trade. This would be boosted by Australia and India's cooperation outside of trade in forums such as the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence and the Quad. At the same time, our paper acknowledges potential areas of conflict between the countries, especially in areas of sensitive data governance. For instance, India's strong preference for data localization is unlikely to change. While Australia could potentially argue for some provisions, they may not be successful. This would go against the tenor of most e-commerce chapters that Australia has signed in recent years. Perhaps India might agree to a clause with a very broad exception or agree to negotiate on this issue in the future when their digital trade relationship is mature. The different privacy frameworks in both countries, with India's proposed PDP bill especially, will also make it difficult to find interoperable mechanisms for personal data transfers. One possibility, subject to India getting APEC membership in the future, would be India also signing the CBPR. The alternative would be for Australia to get an adequacy finding from India after the PDP bill comes into effect. While the strong political relationship between the two countries could be a plus, the different regulatory frameworks of Australia and India could pose problems in positive adequacy finding. The larger economic rationale, however, would suggest that an adequacy finding is the most sensible way forward. Similarly, as discussed earlier, India's concern regarding revenue losses from the moratorium might mean that India would never agree to a provision banning customs duties on electronic transmissions. This may be a hindrance for the open digital trade model of Australia. Perhaps two aspects are critical for India here. The first is a cost-benefit analysis of the moratorium, and the second is the technological and regulatory feasibility of imposing customs duties on electronic transmissions. Similarly, although Australia has been signing several FTAs that prohibit source code disclosure as a condition of market access, India may not be keen to sign such a prohibition as it may reduce possibilities for technological transfer. Finally, the issue of non-discrimination in digital products may also pose specific problems for Australia in the CECA negotiations, which has traditionally included this provision in its FTAs. India's recent digital economy policies clearly provide preference to local digital goods and service providers, especially under the Digital India campaign. Part of India's willingness to negotiate on these difficult issues will also depend on the trade-offs that Australia can offer. For instance, agree to Mode 4 liberalisation for IT services in lieu of market access for Australian digital service providers in India. Another area ripe for negotiations is facilitating digital SMEs in India, providing incentives to India through technical assistance program and agreeing upon meaningful inclusion programs. Despite these differences, an electronic commerce chapter must be recognised for its inherent value for both countries. It's an opportunity for both countries to build a strong, trustworthy and secure foundation for digital trade and investment in a region where Chinese influence poses a problem for both the countries. This would mean for both countries to remain pragmatic in choosing their areas of negotiation and also a willingness to offer incentives toward the other party. This is especially true to Australia, whose current approach to digital trade will not align with India's preferences. Therefore, Australia needs to be more creative and flexible in accommodating the specific challenges of negotiating with India on electronic commerce issues. Our paper also suggests that in this regard, a centralised mechanism to monitor the enforcement of the electronic commerce chapter of the CECA might have an added value. As the digital trade relationship between the two countries mature, it's possible to explore new areas for negotiations or expand existing provisions. We conclude with the hope that the Australia-India CECA will be the start of a new robust digital trade relationship between India and Australia. Thank you.